Hello everyone, my name is Arrow PhD and welcome to my comprehensive in-depth video tutorial covering the PvE Holy Paladin for patch 3.3.5 for the Icecrown Citadel Heroic Raiding tier. This video is a result of Wrath of the Lich King expansion still being popular after more than 10 years since its launch, and with the release of the Icecrown Citadel raid releasing on classic servers, this seems like a great time to introduce the Holy Paladin to new players. The aim of this guide is to teach new Holy Paladin players about the class to get them ready for endgame 25-man heroic raiding content, but some more experienced players might also learn some new tricks. I have been playing on this patch for many years, raiding heroic bosses with tuned up difficulty on the Warmane Lordaeron server with lots of progression and hardcore raiding experience as a Holy Paladin. I have also achieved many things, including solo healing Lich King on 10-man heroic difficulty without the 30% ICC buff, being a part of the Realm First Tribute to Immortality achievement, and so on. Before we start with the class, I believe it's important to understand that healing is a team effort, but in that team of healers, Holy Paladin brings a lot to the table. If you are new to healing in general, keep in mind that to be effective, communication with other healers in your group is important for the overall success of the raid. Holy Paladin is a very powerful healer in patch 3.3.5 with great utility but lots of responsibility. The class is a tank healer, which we will get into a bit later as to why that is, but can also do raid healing and has many raid cooldowns and buffs. The class is quite easy to learn but hard to master as the skill cap is quite high. It takes time and experience to utilize all available abilities to their full potential. The Holy spec is also one of the least gear dependent specs in the whole expansion. Playing Holy Paladin might feel like sometimes you are the unsung hero, as healers in general aren't appreciated much except if something goes wrong. Then healers are the first to blame. Keep in mind that a good healer is less noticeable than a good DPS, and it takes some time to truly prove your worth. Nevertheless, good healers can make any encounter much easier. One last thing to mention here is that a good healer, especially a Holy Paladin, needs to know the fight very well. Know when special boss abilities come to be able to react to them accordingly with either personal or raid cooldowns, know when to precast a heal, and effectively dealing with mana management. Before we get into the class specifics, we will cover the available races when starting with the Holy Paladin class. In the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, there are 4 available races, 3 on the Alliance side and 1 on Horde. When it comes to Alliance, the first available option is Human. Humans in World of Warcraft come with a 3% increased spirit and the every man for himself skill, which makes the race the best PvP choice. The second option are Dwarves, which have mostly tanking related race skills with a Stoneform skill and increased frost resistance. The last race to choose from are the Draenei, which have a 1% increased hit and the gift of the Naru healing spell. This is usually the best choice when rolling a Retribution Paladin. On the Horde side, we have only one available race, being the Blood Elf. Blood Elves have a racial ability called Arcane Torrent, granting them 6% total mana every 2 minutes, and it's off the global cooldown. This skill alone is what makes Blood Elves the best possible choice for playing a PvE Holy Paladin. When it comes to profession options, there are really only 2 best ones. The first and arguably the most important choice is Engineering. Engineering allows the player to enchant their gear with many useful on-use effects such as Nitro Boots, which let you run around really fast for a short amount of time. In Wrath of the Lich King, most classes lack movement impacting skills, so being able to have an ability to quickly move around is imperative when trying to position yourself in the middle of a fight. Keep in mind that most engineering enchants also provide hidden bonuses such as plus 24 critical strike rating with the Nitro Boots. Other useful things provided by engineering also include an on-use haste buff that you can put on your gloves and have the ability to summon Jeeves, Mailbox, and so on. The second profession that is best for a Holy Paladin is jewel crafting, as it allows players to craft dragon gems with increased stats. You can put up to 3 plus 34 intellect gems into your gear, making jewel crafting the best static upgrade you can out of a profession in the game. In the end, we can also mention blacksmithing, which is the next best profession due to the ability to include extra gem sockets into your gear, but is crafting in terms of raw stats. Other professions are unfortunately obsolete for a hardcore PvE player. Now we're gonna go over the talents and glyphs used in a 25-man heroic focused build. In the first row we put 5 out of 5 points in spiritual focus since it reduces pushback suffered from attacks by 70% on all of our healing spells. We don't need any points in Seals of the Pure as that talent is about dealing damage, which as a healer we don't care about. In the second row we go 3 out of 3 in Healing Light since it just generally increases all of our healing done. We put all available points in Divine Intellect because more intellect gives us more mana, which we will need as much as we can get to cast for a longer time. The last talent is about reducing Fears and Disorients, which is mostly a PvP talent that we don't care about it. Aura Mastery is a nice rate cooldown which we pick up for only 1 point. Illumination is one of the most important talents since it enables us to get mana back when critting. This is a huge deal as being in endgame gear allows us to crit a lot, and overall this enables the Holy Paladin to spam those healing spells for maximum output without taking such an impact on our mana. Improved Lay of Hands is nice to have since Lay on Hands as a spell has a very long cooldown. To be able to reduce that can be a nice benefit, and combined with the added effect of reducing physical damage taken, can be a nice buff to a tank or any other raid member from taking melee hits from some enemy adds. In the next row we don't really need to put any points into Improved Concentration Aura. That is because Concentration Aura alone already provides us with 35% reduced pushback and, combined with the Spiritual Focus talent, reduces pushback received to 0%, meaning we can cast all of our spells without any interruptions. We take both points into Improved Blessing of Wisdom, since ideally in a 25-man raid environment Holy Paladins are buffing Wisdom, and having it buffed even further provides a nice benefit to all classes that use mana. Blessed Hands enables a lot of our hand spells, improved ability, so it's a must-have. Fear of the Heart is mostly a PvP talent, since debuffs in raids are taken care of in other ways. We take Divine Favor for its emergency use. This talent is important because it allows us to cast a big heal knowing it will crit, whether that is as a panic reaction to a sudden damage spike, or knowing some big damage is going to come onto the raid and we can heal it more effectively. Sanctified Light yet again increases our critical chances, so we take that. Purifying Power is another PvP talent, since in ICC we are not cleansing so much as to need to reduce the mana costs, and also since the talent deals with damaging attacks that is of no use to us. We take 5 out of 5 in Holy Power, since it again enables a flat crit increase to all of our holy spells. Light's Grace gives us a 100% chance to reduce the cast time of our Holy Light. Since Holy Light is a healing spell we are using the most, having the ability to cast it faster is a no-brainer. Holy Shock is another heal we have available. It is an instant cast and heals for a moderate amount. There is no point in taking Blessed Life as usually healers are not the target of attacks. Spirit Cleansing is a very powerful PvP talent, but doesn't provide much worth in a PvE environment because, as mentioned before, we are not dispelling very much to have much use out of it. On the other hand, Holy Guidance is a massive talent for the PvE Holy Paladin. It increases our spell power by the amount of intellect that we have. That means that if we stack a lot of intellect into our gear, we are also passively increasing our spell power, meaning our spells are going to be more effective. Divine Illumination is another important ability. It provides us with additional mana management and, combined with the 2-piece effect of our tier 10 gear, provides additional healing output. Judgments of the Pure is another buff that we can get that increases our casting speed. Every time we cast a judgment onto our target, we get a buff for 1 minute, which makes our cast time 15% faster. This talent is a must-have and its effect is very important for a Holy Paladin to keep active all of the time. Infusion of Light is an emergency skill that acts as a benefit to our Holy Shock spell. In case of emergency healing needed, we can cast Divine Favor for the 100% crit chance on our next healing spell, and then cast Holy Shock for a nice big instant heal to top a raid member, followed by either an instant cast Flash of Light or a Holy Light with increased crit chance. Enlightened Judgments is important since, as mentioned before, casting a judgment onto a target gives us a haste buff. But since judgments are considered as spells, they are affected by hit rating and can miss our target. Having a longer range and improved hit rating gives us less chance to miss, so we can maintain our haste buff better. Last but definitely not least is the Beacon of Light. This is a spell that makes Holy Paladin be considered as tank healers. What this spell does is it buffs a member of our raid, so any healing that we do on any of the raid members will also heal the beaconed member. This spell is usually put onto the main tank, so Holy Paladins can heal the raid while also simultaneously healing the tank. That is it for the Holy Tree, but we still have some leftover points which we can put into the Protection Tree. Divinity increases our healing, so in order to progress further into the Protection Tree, we put 5 out of 5 points there, as Divine Strength buffs our strength, which we don't need. Stoicism might be considered as a PvP talent, but since the only other option in this row is increasing dodge through anticipation, we better put our points there. We put the other points into Guardian's favor, since it reduces cooldowns for some of our helping spells. In the next row is an opening into one of the biggest raid cooldowns available in the entire game. Divine Sacrifice reduces all incoming damage of the party by a whopping 30%, and further putting 2 points into below Divine Guardian also reduces raid damage by 20%, which is a huge deal. To put our remaining points, there is usually a small dispute between Holy Paladins. I prefer to put my points into Improve Righteous Fury, which reduces all damage by 6%, as the other option is Toughness, which only increases armor and reduces movement impairing effects. 6% reduction in damage has more damage negation because it affects all types of damage, while having some additional armor only reduces physical damage taken, which would require enemies to actually hit us. In a raid environment, this is a very rare occurrence. Having Righteous Fury active increases the threat even when healing, however. In my opinion, having Righteous Fury with the damage reduction talents enabled is a great choice, because if the raid is experiencing threat issues, you can just remove your Righteous Fury. In my experience, it's best to have it active in fights without many enemy adds and high raid damage, for example Blood Queen Lanatel or Sindragosa, while turning it off when a fight has adds that have a chance of attacking you, for example at Lady Deathwhisper. At last, I also want to mention an alternative option to spending your points in the Protection Tree, and that is to put some of them into the Retribution Tree instead. Putting your points into Retribution will yield some higher crit chance due to the Conviction talent and having a decreased mana cost for all instant spells. But the problem with this path is that the gameplay of a PvE Holy Paladin revolves mostly around spamming a castable Holy Light, and also in endgame gear we already have more than enough crit to justify using so many talent points into another tree. At last, Divine Sacrifice is such a major cooldown that we can make a huge impact in raiding, much more than having some more crit, which is the reason Holy Paladins should have their points spent in the Protection Tree. That's it for the talents. Now let's review the glyphs. For glyphs, we have 3 options to choose for major glyphs and 3 for the minor ones. The first and most important glyph for a 25 heroic focused Holy Paladin is the glyph of Seal of Wisdom. Since we are spamming a very mana expensive heal, Holy Light, most of the fight, we need as much help offsetting that cost as we can. This glyph provides a flat 5% reduction in mana, which is a lot over a course of a fight. Next up we have Glyph of Holy Light. With this glyph, Holy Paladins actually become raid healers, as each Holy Light cast also heals additional raid members for an amount for free. In a fight with heavy raid damage, this glyph acts as a major help and is really the only AoE healing option for a Holy Paladin. The last glyph that I recommend is the Glyph of Beacon of Light. Now, Beacon of Light is a buff that lasts for 1 minute, but has a relatively high mana cost. During a fight, Beacon should be buffed on a tank at all times, as it's an integral part of a Holy Paladin's job in the raid. With this glyph, we extend the buff duration to 1 minute and a half, which allows us to focus on other things for a longer time than to keep an eye for this buff, as well as having to use less mana during a course of a fight. Also, keep in mind that recasting Beacon of Light costs a global cooldown, which during we cannot cast anything else. Now that we have gone over the major glyphs, I'll also cover some alternatives. A good alternative to Glyph of Seal of Wisdom is the Glyph of Seal of Light, which boosts all healing spells by 5%. While this does sound good on paper, in endgame gear Holy Light is already topping raid members by itself, so this glyph would in most cases just contribute to overhealing. There is one good fight to use this though, and that's at Velythria Dreamwalker. This is the fight where you heal the boss, and since she has a big health pool, getting off bigger heals is definitely worth it. If your raid has trouble at Velythria, try switching to this glyph. Glyph of Flash of Light and Glyph of Holy Shock are two other major healing glyphs, but are mostly used in PvP, as in PvE our most important spell is Holy Light. For minor glyphs, I would only recommend the usage of one, and that's the Glyph of Lay on Hands, since it reduces the cooldown of that spell by 5 minutes. If you really want to min-max your character, you can also use Glyph of Sense Undead, since it increases damage done to undead enemies by 1%. Since most enemies in ICC are undead, your judgments might do a very small amount of damage more, but in the end, minor glyphs are mostly a personal choice. Now we are going to go over each important ability in the Holy Paladin's arsenal, because it is important to know what each spell does and where it can be used effectively. As a general tip, don't forget to use the highest spell rank available to you. First of all, we will cover raid buffs. Holy Paladins can buff the raid with 3 different blessings. Blessing of Kings increases primary stats of all raid members by 10%. The more gear a person has, the bigger the benefit of this blessing, as the buff is percentage based. Blessing of Wisdom buffs members with increased mana restoration over time. This is the main blessing that Holy Paladins do in a 25-man raid environment, especially if the blessing is talented as mentioned before. The base version of Blessing of Wisdom restores 92 mana every 5 seconds, while the talented one increases that amount to 110 mana per 5 seconds. Keep in mind that this buff only benefits mana users, so it should be used on healers, but it's also important to give this buff to some DPS, especially mages and even hunters. Blessing of Might gives a flat increase in attack power. This buff should be usually applied by Retribution Paladins, because similar to Holy Paladins, they can increase the amount buffed by having it talented. When it comes to buffing, each Paladin in raid should have their buffs pre-assigned before the raid starts and should keep an eye out on the duration of the buffs. These blessings are a huge benefit to the raid, so keeping the members buffed is very important. In a 25-man raid, ideally there should be enough paladins to have all of the buffs covered. It's also worth noting that if there are at least 2 holy paladins in the raid, one can take Blessing of Wisdom and the other can buff kings in the raid. In a 10-man raid though, if there are not enough paladins, a holy paladin should buff the members with different buffs based on what is most beneficial. Usually Holy Paladins buff Blessing of Wisdom on mana users and do Kings on others, while other Paladin, whether that is Protection or Retribution, cast the other applicable buffs. The goal of buffing is so that the raid as a whole benefits as much as possible. Keep in mind that if during a fight a member of the raid dies and is combat resurrected, we should rebuff that member as soon as possible. Last but not least, it is important to remember that the greater 30-minute blessing versions replace the normal 10-minute ones, but in a 10-man raid there might be less paladins to cover all the necessary buffs, so if someone needs another buff than what you are buffing, you can cast the normal 10-minute version on that person and not affect the others. Seals or personal buffs that can be applied to a paladin. There can only be one seal active at a time. The main seal that Holy Paladins should be using is the Seal of Wisdom. This seal gives the paladin a chance that normal melee attacks restore a flat 4% of your total mana. Since the restoration is percentage based, this means that the more mana you have, the more you will get back. This seal is one of the most important mechanics for mana management for Holy Paladins. Because the restoration is dependent on melee hitting your target though, it also means that positioning becomes very important. Ideally, Holy Paladins should be close to the boss so they can get the advantage of this seal's effect. The second seal worth reviewing is Seal of Light. The effect of this seal is that every normal melee attack heals the paladin for a small amount. Because the heal is rather small and only affects us, it is of no real use to the Holy Paladin. As mentioned before during our glyphs review, the only time one might consider using this Seal of Light is if we use the glyph of Seal of Light. Otherwise, it is not worth having this seal active. There are other seals available to paladins, but their effects do not help the Holy Paladin at all and should not be considered. Judgments are spells that put a debuff on our target. Like seals, there are more judgments available to the Holy Paladin. The main one Holy Paladins should be using is Judgment of Light. Judgment of Light debuffs the target for 20 seconds. What this debuff does is it enables a chance that every raid member that is attacking our target to get healed by 2% of their total health. Unlike seals, which only proc from melee attacks, the Judgment debuff enables all types of attack to proc this chance. While 2% of the maximum health does not sound much, the effect does not have any internal cooldown, so each attack any member of a raid does can heal them. And since everybody is spamming their attack abilities on the boss, this effect procs a lot, so the Judgment effect becomes increasingly prominent. The healing effect received from this judgment counts to the total healing done by the paladin. Judgment of Wisdom debuffs the target with the effect that each attack has a chance to restore 2% of our total mana. The same rules apply to this effect as to the Judgment of Light one. Judgment of Justice gives us a chance to stun our target. While there are some uses in raiding for this judgment, in most cases it is not used by Holy Paladins. There can be only one active judgment on a target per paladin in the raid. This means that, for example, if there are two paladins in the group and both cast the Judgment of Light, the healing effect only counts into the paladin's healing that last applied the debuff. For Judgment of Light's effect, there are also several factors that can scale the healing. The general factor that increases healing done by Judgment of Light are the Druid's Tree of Life or Paladin's Improved Devotion Aura talents, which increase all healing received by 6%, followed by some class-specific healing multipliers. This is important to know since there might be a general misconception that a Holy Paladin heals more by using Judgment of Light. This is not the case. Any paladin can debuff the target and the healing effect remains unchanged. In a normal 25-man raid, Judgment of Light should be used by Protection Paladins and Holy Paladins as the debuff uptime is important for the overall raid healing. Since casting Judgment costs one global cooldown, Holy Paladins should ideally only use this once every 20 seconds to keep the debuff active, or once a minute if Protection Paladins are able to maintain the debuff themselves. But it's best practice to judge the boss a bit more often, as judgments are considered spells and are affected by hit rating, meaning they have a chance to miss. As mentioned before, there are several talents that add additional benefits when using our judgment. The most important one is Judgments of the Pure, which buffs us with a 15% increased haste every time we successfully judge a target. This buff lasts for 1 minute and during these times we have to judge again to reset the timer. This buff is a huge benefit to the Holy Paladin and should be maintained throughout the whole fight. In the end, keep in mind that in order to be able to use judgments, a seal buff needs to be active first on ourselves. Of a debate regarding which paladin spec should use which judgment, so here is my take on it. Overall, the effect of Judgment of Light is much more important for the raid as it provides constant healing, while Judgment of Wisdom only provides mana return. Most classes have other mana managing mechanics, so the Wisdom debuff doesn't bring as much effect, while constant healing is a great benefit for the whole raid all of the time. In a normal raid, both debuffs should be active all of the time. Providing that there are enough paladins, as mentioned before, protection paladins should be able to keep up the Judgment of Light debuff as part of their rotation, and one retribution paladin can also cast this judgment, as this way the debuff is constantly applied on the boss. Providing there is another retribution paladin, he can be casting Judgment of Wisdom. This way both debuffs are constantly applied, so in reality it doesn't actually matter which judgment the Holy Paladin is using, as long as we judge that boss at least once a minute for the haste buff. My opinion is that we should still be using Judgment of Light because, as mentioned before, it is the more important debuff of the two. However, in a situation with less paladins, Holy Paladins might be better off using Judgment of Wisdom because judging costs a global cooldown during which we don't cast a heal, while other paladin specs are doing judgment as part of their rotation. The Beacon of Light is one of the most important Holy Paladin spells. It is an instant cast buff to a friendly member of the party or raid, and every heal that we cast on others also heals the beacon target in full, without any additional mana costs. Beacon should usually be applied to the main tank, or rather the tank currently tanking the boss. This way we can focus on healing others while ensuring the tank also gets healed. This spell makes us so-called tank healers because it is mostly the Holy Paladin that keeps the tanks alive through Beacon. Bosses usually hit hard and tanks need to be kept topped all the time because if a tank dies it can very quickly lead to a raid wipe. Beacon of Light lasts for 1 minute or 1 minute and 30 seconds if glyphed. As mentioned before, casting Beacon costs relatively a lot of mana and also puts us on a global cooldown. While one global cooldown might not seem a lot, in a fight with heavy tank damage, like for example 25-man heroic Lich King, tanks can die incredibly quickly if not topped off fast enough. Good practice is to beacon the tank just before the pull and recast it just a bit before the buff falls off. To be as efficient as possible, it is also a good idea to recast beacon when you have to move, because we cannot hard cast heals then, but we can still use our instant spells. Keep in mind that there are no restrictions as to how many beacons can be applied to the target. If the fight requires only one tank, all Holy Paladins should beacon that one tank. But if a fight requires multiple tanks that are all taking damage, Holy Paladins should beacon their own tank to ensure all tanks are getting healed all of the time. A good tip to remember when healing with Beacon of Light is that a Holy Paladin should avoid directly healing the target that also has their beacon applied to them. Instead, it's a good idea to heal other melee members that are close to the beaconed tank, because the splash heal from Glyph of Holy Light also heals the tank, providing increased healing. Holy Light is our main healing spell. It is a castable spell that heals for a high amount, but also costs a lot of mana. Most of the Holy Paladin gameplay revolves around spamming Holy Light. Because of the high mana cost, one of the main reasons Paladins stack Intellect is to have enough mana to not run out of it when using this heal. The base cast time of Holy Light is quite high, around 2 seconds, but there are a few ways to lower it. The first way is to get enough haste rating. This is usually done passively by equipping the appropriate gear, and alternatively to put some haste gems into your sockets. The next thing you can do is to throw a judgment onto the target to receive the 15% haste buff, which severely reduces the cast time. The last thing comes passively from spamming Holy Light because of the aforementioned Light's Grace talent, which reduces the next Holy Light by 0.5 seconds. Because we are spamming Holy Light, pretty much every heal is going to be shortened by that amount. Keep in mind that this reduction only lasts for 15 seconds. While it is a long time, if we do not cast any Holy Light in this period, it will reset the cast time. Holy Shock is our instant spell that heals for a moderate amount. Unlike Holy Light, which we spam almost all of the time, the usage of Holy Shock is a bit more limited. It is great when you are on the move and need to top someone off, but we can also very effectively use this in an emergency situation where using Divine Favor before casting Holy Shock gives us a nice big critical heal, which we can then follow up with an instant cast Flash of Light because of the infusion of light talent. Using Holy Shock this way basically heals the target to full health. It is also recommended that when you move and have nothing else to cast, to perhaps cast Holy Shock because the infusion of light talent also boosts our next Holy Light critical chance by 20%. Flash of Light is our second castable heal. It is a fast and inexpensive heal, but heals for a relatively low amount. This spell is mostly used in a PvP environment, but does have some niche uses in PvE. If we heal someone with the Sacred Shield buff applied to them, Flash of Light also procs a heal over time effect on them. The effect is rather small, but can provide some additional healing nonetheless. I would still recommend using Flash of Light in certain situations. If you know your healing target or raid is not going to be taking a lot of damage, you can use Flash of Light to provide some healing while not losing too much of your mana. But this way of using Flash of Light requires some experience to know when switching to Holy Light needs to be done. Sacred Shield is a buff that we should usually apply on the tank aggroing the boss. The shield's effect absorbs some amount of damage taken by our target, which over a course of a fight means quite a bit of damage negation and also increases with spell power. This buff lasts for 30 seconds and should always be applied. There can only be one shield applied on a friendly target, which means that if there are two Holy Paladins, each should shield their own tank. Keep in mind that it is also an instant spell that triggers a global cooldown, so we should apply it close to its end or when we know we won't be able to rebuff it for a while or when we are on the move. The shield can be applied by all paladins packs, and protection paladins usually keep the buff applied for themselves. For other tanks, it is usually the Holy Paladin's responsibility to keep the shield buffed. Keep in mind that the absorbed damage counts toward the total absorbs done by the Paladin. This applies to the last Paladin that applied the shield onto the target. Lay on Hands is the last heal available to the Holy Paladin. This heal is an emergency heal which heals for a very big amount. It can basically top our target instantly, but has a very long cooldown, so expect to use this heal only once per fight if the situation arises. Since this heal can basically save someone's life, it should only be used in a critical situation, but keep in mind that this requires some reflexes in order to maximize its usage. Through the improved Lay on Hands talent, we also add an additional effect of lowering one's physical damage taken by 20% for 15 seconds, which is a nice benefit if we just used it on a tank taking big melee hits. As per the skill description, it says that the casted heal equals our total health, but there are actually some additional multipliers that can increase this number. Lay on Hands can also be increased via Avenging Wrath and Divine Illumination buffs and some other factors, and most importantly is also affected by the amount of stacks you get for increased healing during the Valencia Dreamwalker fight. Because of this fact, Lay on Hands should be used in conjunction with all these buffs at the end of the fight for maximum effect, as the heal can reach big numbers. Divine Plea is one of the most important mechanics for mana restoration besides Seal of Wisdom. On a relatively short 1 minute cooldown, this skill restores 25% of our total mana in 15 seconds. Because the mana return is percentage based, again the more mana we have, the more we get back. This skill is one of the most important and powerful skills to be used by Holy Paladins, and it contributes to the fact that Holy Paladins are one of the strongest and most viable healers in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, especially considering the fact that in endgame gear we have upwards of 40,000 mana, meaning a tick of Divine Plea returns us almost 2000 mana, which is more than what it costs us to cast Holy Light. But with great power comes great liability. Using Divine Plea causes us to heal for 50% less for its duration. Because of this, to get the maximum out of the skill and to cause as little setback to our healing as possible, it's very important to know when to cast it. If we know there will be a period of heavy damage incoming, it's best not to use it. On the other hand, if we know that a moment where less healing will be needed, we should use it. To offset some of the effect of the decreased healing, we can use our Avenging Wrath spell or Divine Illumination 2-piece bonus effect from our tier 10 set. You can actually use both of these spells at the same time to actually even increase healing while using Divine Plea, but I would recommend against it. Since Holy Light is a strong heal by itself and Divine Plea has a short cooldown, it's best to use Divine Plea once with Avenging Wrath and on the next cooldown with Divine Illumination. This way you are still healing well while also gaining back a lot of mana. We had already mentioned Divine Favor many times now, with its use cases regarding Holy Shock or other spells, but here I would just mention that it's important to know that this spell is off the global cooldown, so you can press it while almost instantly cast the next heal for maximum effect. Avenging Wrath, or colloquially known as the Paladin's Wings, is a cooldown which boosts our heals by 20%. As mentioned before during our Divine Plea skill, using them both and with Divine Illumination, Holy Paladins are an excellent class at being able to manage their mana while continuously casting big heals. Divine Illumination is a skill with two effects. The primary is that for the next 15 seconds all of our spells cost 50% less mana, which is nice in regards to our mana management. With the added effect of the previously mentioned 2-piece bonus of our tier 10 gear, this skill actually becomes a healing cooldown as it increases our heals by 35%, which is more than Avenging Wrath. Aura Mastery is a raid cooldown that improves the effect of an aura by 100%. Auras are buffs that provide small benefits to the whole raid group. In a 25-man raid, all auras should be active, except perhaps the Crusader aura as it has no combat effectiveness, to provide more armor and resistances. For the Holy Paladin, Concentration aura is important as it reduces pushback of our heals. Aura Mastery should be used before big raid-wide damage occurs, and it is important to know the type of damage incoming. For example, at Festergut, when he does his Pungent Blight ability, it is Shadow type damage, so increasing our Shadow resistance will reduce the damage taken. Before he finishes his cast, we can use Aura Mastery. If a boss has an Interrupt type ability coming, we can also cast the Concentration Aura Mastery to negate the effect, but keep in mind that there are no such encounters in ICC. Divine Sacrifice is one of the most important raid cooldowns as having it talented decreases incoming damage by 20% for the whole raid. Unlike Aura Mastery, the type of damage is not important as the reduction is flat. For the damage reduction to take effect, we must use Divine Sacrifice before incoming damage. Because of this fact, to use it most effectively, a Holy Paladin needs to know the fight well and be aware when to anticipate the usage of this spell. To know how to use Divine Sacrifice safely and effectively, it is also important to understand its mechanics. As mentioned before during our talents review, for Divine Sacrifice to affect the whole raid, 2 points need to be put into Divine Guardian. When pressing the Divine Sacrifice spell, you activate 2 buffs. One called Divine Sacrifice and the other called Divine Guardian. The Divine Sacrifice part redirects damage from others onto yourself. Divine Guardian is a buff that just flatly decreases all damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds. Since incoming raid damage can be huge, Divine Sacrifice would reduce your health significantly and might even lead to your death. That is why we should always remove this buff so only Divine Guardian stays active. This way we make sure that the raid takes reduced damage while also staying safe in the process. The best way to handle this is to make a macro that cancels Divine Sacrifice as soon as you cast it. Divine Shield is our personal oh-shit button. Also known as the Paladin's Bubble, it makes us immune to any damage and other negative effects for 8 seconds. When using the spell, any debuffs that we have will also disappear. When used properly, it can basically save our life without many consequences, as while under its effect, you can still cast spells or move around. It is our second chance in a fight. Using this spell can also be used in other non-emergency situations. During the Sindragosa fight, for example, a paladin can bubble when getting the Unchained Magic debuff, meaning we can lose the debuff and continue casting, making the fight much easier from a healing perspective. Keep in mind though that if you have many stacks of Unchained Magics, you will explode for the appropriate amount of damage, and while you yourself are immune and won't die, other members around you will take the full damage and can still die. That is why it's important to use bubble while having low stacks, or if you are on a high stack count, to use the spell when far away from the raid group. Forbearance is a debuff that is applied to any friendly target that had a paladin cast certain helpful spells on him. The debuff lasts for 2 minutes and is triggered when using either Divine Shield, Divine Protection, Hand of Protection or Lay on Hands. When the debuff is active, you cannot use these spells again. The spell basically ties these abilities together in a way that requires paladins to plan when to use them and learn how to deal with Forbearance. Hand of Protection is the first hand spell we will cover. This spell protects friendly targets from any physical damage for 10 seconds, but during which they also cannot deal physical abilities. This spell can also negate fall damage once applied. Due to the fact that the target cannot use physical attacks, Hand of Protection is best used on casters as spellcasting is not inhibited. This spell can best be used during the Dreadbringer Saurfang encounter because all damage during that fight is counted as physical, but can also be used in some niche situations like during the Sindragosa fight. When she uses Blistering Cold, one can use the hand on a caster to make him immune to her grab. This way he can continue casting and damaging the boss. The hand's fall damage negation can also be effectively used during the Lich King fight. Towards the end of phase 2, if there are any Valkyries still active and Lich King is pushed into his second transition phase, the Valkyries will go up while still having their targets grabbed. Once they reach the top, they let go of the raid members and they can fall to their death due to the height, but we can prevent this by using Hand of Protection on them. Hand of Sacrifice is a minor cooldown that acts in a similar way to Divine Sacrifice. If Divine Sacrifice makes the whole raid take less damage, Hand of Sacrifice can be cast on only one member of the raid. This spell can usually be cast on tanks when some high damage is coming their way, or some other target taking significant damage. The fact of taking a portion of the damage yourself should be considered when using this spell, so prioritize healing yourself. Hand of Salvation is a great tool for managing aggro. This spell lowers the target's aggro by 2% every second for 10 seconds. Threat in Wrath of the Lich King is an important mechanic that has to be dealt with, and one should always keep an eye out for it. Tanks should always have the highest aggro because they can survive the heavy hits dealt by bosses, as DPS usually has less survivability. If you see a DPS that is high on threat, this spell should be used on them. Towards the end of the expansion, usually the highest threat are mages and warriors. This spell should mostly be used on them also, because some other classes have their own spells to deal with aggro. Keep in mind that this spell is also percentage based. This means the higher someone is on the threat meter, the bigger effect this spell will have in lowering their threat. That is why I recommend using this ability after threat is already established and you can see who is actually risking aggroing the boss. Hand of Freedom is the last hand spell. This is a helpful utility spell which grants freedom from any movement impairing effects on the target. In ICC there are quite a few mechanics that reduce our movement speed. Hand of Freedom is of great use especially on tanks during certain encounters like Rot Phase, where the tank kiting the big ooze might run into the slime puddles which put a slowing effect. Use Hand of Freedom on him to help him avoid the slow and continue kiting the ooze without interruption. Another great situation to use the spell is at Sindragosa. Due to her Frost Breath, tanks get a slowing debuff. When Sindragosa flies up during her transition phase, one can use Hand of Freedom on the tank to help him move to the raid group faster to avoid getting tombed. The Paladin class has access to Cleanse, which is a helpful spell that can remove negative effects from others. Cleanse instantly removes one poison, disease and magic debuff from a friendly target. In ICC there are certain debuffs that require dispelling, some more and some less important. Most of the debuffs are magic type, which means Holy Paladins can cleanse them. The most important debuffs to dispel as a Holy Paladin are at Lich King, where in transition phases tanks that are tanking the Raging Spirits can get silenced by their Shriek attack. Dispel the silence effect so tanks can continue attacking and aggroing the adds. It is also important to know that some debuffs require some timing when trying to dispel them. For example, at Rot phase, random players can get inflicted with the Mutated Infection debuff. After the dispel, a small sticky ooze will appear that continues to attack the afflicted player and spawn some damaging AoE pulse. That is why dispelling too early or too late can greatly impact the rate, and you have to figure out when the timing is right. Divine Intervention is a nice utility spell that can be used if the raid is expecting to wipe. The Paladin can use Divine Intervention on a target to let him survive, but the Paladin himself dies. It is most effectively used during a wipe, where you can put the spell onto a healer that can resurrect others. This means less running back to the boss for the raid, saving time. Divine Intervention can also be used in certain boss encounters. When using this ability on a target, the target loses all debuffs. This can be exploited during the Deathbringer Sourfang fight to avoid the damage done by Mark of the Fallen Champion. The spell can also be used during the Sindragosa fight when trying to solo tank her. As tanks get increased stacks in her last phase due to the Mystic Buffet debuff, they take increasingly more damage every time she casts her Frost Breath. At some high number of stacks, the breath can one-shot the tank. Using Divine Intervention on the tank though can make him lose all stacks, effectively resetting the debuff. Another very niche situation where Divine Intervention can be used is at Lich King. In the last phase, putting this spell on someone will make him immune to Lich King's grab when teleporting everyone into Frostmourne. This way, a DPS can basically attack the boss for one whole minute uninterrupted. If a Retribution Paladin casts Divine Intervention, he can get Combat Rest also to join the other DPS. This way both of them can attack the boss. This tactic can be used during speed kill attempts, but I would recommend avoid using Divine Intervention this way on normal attempts due to relatively high risk. Keep in mind that using Divine Intervention during encounters though requires a death by the Paladin. Since Holy Paladins are healers and are usually playing an important role in the raid, this spell is best used by Retribution Paladins that can be combat resurrected as soon as they cast it. Redemption is a skill that can resurrect dead players when outside of combat. Use this on lazy players that alt-tab the game after a wipe. Keep in mind that in order to get this ability in Wrath of the Lich King expansion, players must complete a short class-specific questline that starts at their trainer. Last but not least, Holy Paladins have a few spells that can deal damage. While the primary role of the Holy Paladin is being a healer and keeping others alive, we can still sometimes do considerable damage if the situation requires it. In this part I would also like to mention the usage of Holy Wrath as a minor cooldown. This damaging spell only works on undead enemies and in addition to damaging them also stuns them for a short time. You can use Holy Wrath on trash mobs in ICC and even normal adds on Lady Deathwhisper to get a couple of seconds of no damage to top the raid. In this section we are going to go over stats and gearing for the Holy Paladin. We will review important stats as well as the best in slot gear in the last patch of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. Our stat priority is as follows. The most important stat is Intellect, followed by Haste, Critical Rating, then Spell Power, Mana per 5 seconds, and lastly Hit Rating. Our most important primary stat is Intellect. As we have already covered our talents and abilities, you could notice that a lot of them were percentage based when it comes to mana usage. Seal of Wisdom, Divine Plea, even Arcane Torrent give huge mana returns when having a large mana pool. The other reason to stack Intellect is also because, as previously mentioned, Our primary heal is Holy Light, which is very expensive. In order to not run out of mana, we need as much of it as possible. In this expansion, each point of intellect gives us additional mana as well as some crit and spell power. Stacking intellect provides an increasingly higher potential the more of it we have. This is because intellect also provides us with additional benefits via the Holy Guidance talent, which further increases our spell power from it, and the talent Illumination allows our critical heals to return additional mana. Haste allows us to cast faster. A faster cast time means more healing in a given amount of time. Haste also lowers the global cooldown. Crit increases our critical chances to land a big heal on our target. Overall, more crit means more healing as well as the previously mentioned mana returning mechanic. Spell power is not as important to stack due to the already large heals from Holy Light. Especially when critting with Holy Light, the amount at high gear levels is around 20,000 healed, which means one cast usually tops our raid members to full health. Spell power should always be passively gained from gear alone, we should never jam for it. Mana per 5 seconds at the end of this expansion becomes increasingly less important due to other much better mana returning mechanics available to the Holy Paladin. It is still useful, but not to the point of needing to prioritize this stat over others. As Holy Paladins, hit is also a stat we need to consider because of the judgments of the pure buff we get when judging our targets. While hit is not a priority stat for us, it is important to know that we can miss our target and can fail to keep up the haste buff, so it is not completely useless. It is important to know that judgment damage is considered as physical. As bosses in Wrath of the Lich King are all level 83, the minimum amount of hit you need to not miss with physical spells is 8%. The closer you are to this number, the lower the chances to miss, but anything higher is wasted. Last but not least, I want to talk about the Spirit stat. Spirit in Wrath of the Lich King regenerates health and mana when out of combat. When in combat though, health regeneration stops completely, while the mana regeneration is subject to the so-called 5-second rule. Whenever you cast a spell that uses mana, spirit-based mana regeneration stops for 5 seconds. If during this time you cast any new spell, the timer starts again for another 5 seconds. This basically means that during combat, if we are spamming our healing spells, we do not regenerate any mana due to Spirit. The only time Spirit allows players to regenerate mana is through talents. Some healers like priests and restoration druids have talents that allow mana restoration due to Spirit. Some other classes have other uses for spirits, such as warlocks that can increase their spell power by casting life tap if they use the appropriate glyph. Holy Paladins, on the other hand, have absolutely no use for spirit, as there are no talents or glyphs available to allow any benefits when in combat. Spirit is therefore a useless stat and should always be ignored. Spirit was reworked with the launch of Cataclysm, when in patch 4.0.1 Spirit became an important mana regeneration stat for all healing classes. But in patch 3.3.5 the mechanics of Spirit do not affect all classes equally. Now we will cover the best in slot gear for the PvE Holy Paladin at the end of patch 3.3.5. This gear will be a mix of mostly 25-man heroic ICC and Ruby Sanctum raids. We will cover gear pieces, gems and enchants, and at the end discuss some alternatives between different pieces of gear. Holy Paladins are the least gear dependent healers in Wrath of the Lich King due to the fact that most spells do not scale so much from our stats as some other healers. The class is also perhaps one of the easiest to gear up because paladins can wear all types of armor, from cloth to plate. This means that whatever the armor type, we can always choose the best piece for us. Before we get into the gear, I want to talk a bit about armor proficiency in general. In Wrath of the Lich King, there is no such thing as armor proficiency, meaning there are no special benefits or negative effects when a certain class wears different types of armor. Armor proficiency came into effect with the release of Cataclysm, where classes got a passive 5% increase in their primary stat when wearing the highest type of armor they can, as a way to discourage players from using the gear that was meant for another class. Although the highest level of armor that paladins can wear is plate, there is absolutely no reason to pass on some cloth or leather items in Wrath of the Lich King if the stats on the piece are the ones we need. In general, Holy Paladins should wear the highest eye level gear that they can get that has spell power, haste and crit on it. Try to avoid pieces with the crit and NP5 combo. When it comes to gemming, Holy Paladins should only really use one meta gem, a Nightmare tier gem to activate the meta gem, and then just stack yellow plus 20 intellect or plus 20 haste gems. Spell power and crit should only come from gear itself, and chasing after socket bonuses is not as important since most of them give spell power, which is much less valuable than other stats for us. Due to the fact that healing is reactive in nature, healers don't really have a definitive best gear setup like DPS classes do. Every fight and raid can be a bit different and different players require different amounts of healing. This is why I encourage all Holy Paladins to find what best works for themselves, as everyone has a slightly different playstyle. The gear that I am going to show you and the primary and secondary stats are what work well for me. For you it might be a bit different, so try to see what is most comfortable for you. This is why I will skip my comments regarding gemming, as it is the easiest to switch around to align with your playstyle. At endgame gear, my personal opinion is that every Holy Paladin should aim to have around 40,000 mana when fully buffed, and their haste should be somewhere between 1100 and 1350, so the Holy Light cast time during combat is around 1.1 seconds to 1.2 seconds. Keep in mind that the haste hard cap for Holy Paladins is at 1994 haste, at which point your Holy Light cast time is 1 second without accounting for Bloodlust. 1 second is the lowest a global cooldown can be lowered to, so this is the reason having more haste is not recommended. If you do account for Bloodlust, having about 1400 haste is the cap, beyond which it is not recommended to go. For information, for a 1.2 second Holy Light cast you need 1115 haste, for 1.1 second cast 1514 haste, and for 1 second the before mentioned 1994 haste. For the headpiece we choose the tier 10 helm Sanctified Lightsworn headpiece. We put the meta gem called Insightful Earthsiege Diamond gem and a Nightmare tier gem to activate it into the sockets. The mana restoration effect of the meta gem procs a lot and gives us 600 mana every time. At best in slot gear it is very important having a Nightmare tier in this helm because it gives us a socket bonus of plus 9 spell power. Having this gem in literally any other piece of gear is worse as we cannot achieve the same socket bonus. For enchanting the helm, Arcanum of Burning Mysteries adds spell power and crit to the helm. We get this enchant from the Kirin Tor Reputation Quartermaster. For neck slot, Blood Queen's Crimson Choker is best, dropped by Blood Queen Lanatel. For shoulders, we again use the tier 10 shoulders Sanctified Lightsworn Spolders with the Greater Inscription of the Storm enchant that we can buy when we're exalted with the Sons of Hodir. The enchant gives spell power and crit. Cloak of the Burning Dusk drops from Hellion. We put the Greater Speed enchant on it to increase haste. The chest piece Rot Resistant Breastplate drops from Rotface. I like to put the plus 250 mana enchant on this piece as it is the best enchant to maximally boost mana. An alternative to this enchant is the powerful stats enchant, which adds plus 10 points into each of the primary stats. Note that this only affects primary stats, so we only get a 10-point increase in our intellect, which gives us an additional plus 150 mana as opposed to the other enchant, but we gain a small amount of additional crit. The difference between these two enchants is rather small, so I think it depends what you need the most. Mana for better mana management or stats for a slightly bigger healing output. For wrists, Hellion drops us Phase Shifter's Bracers, which we enchant with the exceptional Intellect enchant. If we compare these bracers with the Cloth Bracers of Fiery Night that also drop from Hellion, there is a very small difference between them. We gain a bit more haste with the cloth wrists, but if we put a yellow gem into the leather bracers, we gain a socket bonus, meaning we get a boost in 2 stats rather than just 1 stat with the cloth wrists. If you really want to look at the comparison from a min-maxing perspective, leather wrists also give us a bit more armor as well. For our hands we use Fallen Lord's handguards that drop from Lady Deathwhisper. We can enchant this piece with an on-use haste effect from engineering called hyperspeed accelerators to gain a small additional cooldown when healing. Halion's split shape belt is what we use for our waist slot. We can enchant this item if we have engineering to get a small AoE damage ability which also stuns our targets. We also put the Eternal Belt Buckle enchant which grants us an additional gem socket. For legs, Plaguebringer's Stained Pants from Festergut are best in slot. This item grants us a ton of haste, but also has hit rating on them. As mentioned before, we need a bit of hit to help with our judgments. With these pants we gain 104 hit rating, which overall raises our hit to 3.96%. But with the additional 4% hit we get from our Enlightened Judgments talent, our judgment spell reaches 7.96% hit rating. Remember that bosses in ICC are level 83, so we need 8% hit to not miss with our judgments, so we come very close to not missing. At best in slot gear, this is the closest we can get, and it generally proves to be enough to not have any trouble with maintaining our judgments in a fight. For leg enchant, Sapphire's Spell Threat is the best as it gives spell power and stamina. The other similar Brilliant Spell Threat enchant gives spell power and spirit, but as mentioned before, we do not have any use for spirit, so this enchant should be avoided. For our feet we use Foreshadow Steps that drop from Helion. With engineering we can put the Nitro Boosts enchant that is a non-use effect which let us run around really fast for 5 seconds. It also gives a hidden bonus of plus 24 critical rating. For rings, the first one drops from Helion and is the Ring of Phased Regeneration. This ring gives us haste and MP5 stats, but since it is the highest eye level healing ring available, it is considered as best in slot. We get the other ring of Rapid Ascent from the Gunship battle. Unless you are an enchanter, we cannot put any enchants on our rings. One alternative when it comes to rings is the Ashen Verdict Reputation ring called Ashen Band of Endless Wisdom. This is an eye level 277 with haste and MP5, same as the best in slot Helion ring, but with the added bonus of having a proc which increases spell power. This ring is worse than the Helion one because Ring of Phased Regeneration provides overall better stats, and when close to endgame gear, Holy Paladins don't really need much more spell power, especially in form of a proc chance, because Holy Light is already topping players as it is such a powerful heal. More spell power would mostly just contribute to overhealing rather than helping the raid. Now let's cover trinkets. Trinkets for healers, especially Holy Paladins, can vary a lot. There is no best in slot trinkets because every fight has different dynamics. Sometimes you need a lot of healing output due to big raid damage, while other times single target damage can be quite high, putting a strain on our mana. It also kind of depends on your gear level. Sometimes you might lack more spell power, or you might want to prioritize having more intellect. It really all depends on different situations. Here I will cover what I think are the best trinket setups, as well as cover some alternatives and their use cases. In my opinion, the best overall trinket for 25-man heroic raiding is the Glowing Twilight Scale from Helion. It provides a ton of spell power which boosts healing a lot, and also has an on-use effect which provides great raid healing when needed, so consider this an output trinket. The second trinket is very dependent on what you are doing. This is a common debate between Holy Paladins on which is the best, so here is my take on it. The debate is between Soulless from Trial of the Crusader and Meteorite Crystal from Algalon in Ulduar. Both of these trinkets provide a lot of mana in one way or another, so having a combo of one of these trinkets with the previously mentioned GTS is the best setup for 25-man raids. I will not go into much depth and maths behind calculations as it would take too much time, so here is just a quick overview. Solace provides a constant 144 mana per 5 seconds and a lot of spell power to boost our healing. Meteorite Crystal is tailor-made for the Holy Paladin spec because it gives us a lot of intellect, and the on-use effect gives us 2 stacks per heal if we have a target beaconed, because the heal on the beacon is counted as a separate heal. In ideal conditions and with all things considered, Meteorite Crystal on average provides about 165 mana per 5 seconds, but we don't get much spell power from it. So we can see that in terms of mana return, Meteorite Crystal wins every time. According to my testing, the spell power difference between the two trinkets makes for about 700 to 1000 per heal more when having Solace equipped. With these facts in mind, I would consider using Solace when raiding ICC without the 30% buff and use Meteorite Crystal with the ICC buff. But still consider this choice for yourself. If you need more mana, Meteorite Crystal is always better than Solace, but if you lack healing, the latter is a better choice. One last thing to mention is that using both Solace and Meteorite Crystal at the same time provides the best mana returns a Holy Paladin could hope for. I would suggest using this combo in fights where raid damage is not that high, and I also personally always use this combo when doing 10-man runs and just disregard GTS as the healing is not as intense as in 25-man raids. The best Libram for PvE Holy Paladins is the Libram of Renewal, which can be bought for Emblems of Heroism in Dalaran. This Libram reduces the mana cost of Holy Light by 113 mana, which is about a flat 10% decrease in mana usage of our main healing spell, and this is absolutely huge for such an easy to obtain piece of gear. The only other alternative I would mention is the Libram of Veracity, which has a chance to proc spell power when casting Holy Light. This Libram is great to use during Valithria Dreamwalker, but otherwise I suggest to stick to Renewal. Any other Librams should be dismissed. Bulwark of Smoldering Steel from Lord Marogar is the best offhand. We enchant this shield with greater intellect for plus 25 intellect. The best weapon for a PvE Holy Paladin even in patch 3.3.5 is the legendary mace from Ulduar Valanir Hammer of Ancient Kings. The mace provides decent stats, but what makes it the best weapon option for us is the proc. Enchant this weapon with the major intellect enchant. The way Valanir works is that every time you heal a person that is not at 100% health, you have a chance to proc a shield that absorbs 15% of the amount healed. This shield then also stacks the absorbing effect with the next heals that the target receives and lasts for 15 seconds. There is an internal cooldown of 45 seconds, but because 15 seconds of it is already in use, realistically it procs around every 30 seconds. Why this is so great for Holy Paladins is that our Holy Light is a very strong heal, and with the average heal being about 20,000, 15% of this is around 3,000 damage that can get absorbed. But since we are also spamming our Holy Light, we can stack this absorb very quickly and can build a strong shield on the tanks, for example. The shield can also proc off our Glyph of Holy Light splash heals, meaning we are simultaneously building shields for other members of the raid, and overall this means a lot of additional damage negation in the raid instead of wasting our heals on overhealing. On average, this weapon alone contributes to around 15 to 20% of all healing and absorbs done in a fight, which is huge for only one piece of gear. To clear up some misconceptions about this weapon, be aware that in order to proc the effect, direct healing is required by the Holy Paladin. This means all of our own healing spells will work, but the effect won't proc by casting Judgment of Light or having damage absorbed by our Sacred Shield. This weapon also gets increasingly better when more healers have it in the raid, because all heals contribute to one shield proc. In a fight with constant raid damage, the absorbs can make quite a noticeable difference. The next best weapon is the Lich King weapon, either Blood Surge or Royal Scepter of Terenas, as they both provide the same stats. The Lich King weapon provides the best possible stats out of any weapon, and is only overshadowed by the absorbing effect of Valanir. Because of this, it's the best weapon to use at Valithria Dreamwalker and most fights in 10-man mode that don't have heavy raid damage. Now, I have shown you my own setup with gear, gems and enchants. There is actually a gearing setup calculated as the theoretically best one by another great Holy Paladin named EQE. This setup features a bit more spell power and intellect with a bit less haste, and you can check all the calculations in an Excel spreadsheet posted in the description below. This best setup relies on the ability to heal as effectively as possible, and with the additional spell power also increases Sacred Shield absorbs done and provides overall more healing. I would recommend new Holy Paladins follow this way of gearing and then see if it works for you or if you need to change some stats around to align with your playstyle. Last but not least, I want to cover using our tier 10 gear 2-piece effect as opposed to using 4 pieces to achieve the 4-piece bonus. The 2-piece effect is hugely important as Divine Illumination becomes a strong healing cooldown in addition to its original effect, so there should be no debate here that it is absolutely worth using. On the other hand, the 4-piece bonus provides us with the effect that every Holy Shock cast reduces the next Holy Light cast by 0.3 seconds. This effect is worth not overlooking as it still has some niche uses. If a fight features a lot of movement, it can definitely shine in certain moments. The problem is that most of encounters in ICC don't really require a lot of moving around. The only fights where I would consider using the 4-piece bonus are mostly Professor Putricide and the Lich King. But keep in mind that the tier 10 pieces of gear feature less stats and miss an entire gem socket, which overall provides a more negative outcome than it brings positives. Nevertheless, the pieces to use when aiming for 4-piece bonus are the helm, shoulders and chest due to this having spell power, haste and crit stats, and the gloves as for pants, Plaguebringer state pants still provide a huge benefit when wearing. In this short section we will cover what I believe are the most important add-ons and macros to be used by Holy Paladins. In order to be effective as a Holy Paladin, it is important to always be aware of what is happening in the raid. It is also important to know when special boss mechanics will occur in order to prepare yourself and heal as effective as possible. This is why the first add-on and arguably the most important one you need is Deadly Boss Mods or an equivalent add-on. This add-on lets you see all different timers as well as special warnings for different abilities. The second add-on that I highly recommend is any type of raid frames add-on such as Healbot, Voodoo, Grit or the like. With these add-ons you can better see the health of all raid members at once as well as buffs or debuffs that are casted on a particular player. I personally use Healbot, although I would actually probably not recommend new players to use this one as it doesn't have as many settings as some of the other add-ons and it is not as user friendly. It still does the job and I got used to it, which is why I continue to use it, but I personally believe it's one of the worst ones and I encourage that if you are new to healing, use Grit or something similar. The next add-on that I and many others find extremely useful is Weak Auras. Weak Auras is a massive add-on with tons of settings and configurations that lets you track all kinds of different things. For Holy Paladins, I recommend to use this to better track some raid debuffs and mechanics, as well as some of your personal procs and abilities such as the Divine Plea time and different raid cooldowns. You can also track boss swing timers to heal more efficiently as you can time your heals and not blindly spam your casts. SCADA or Recount might not be as necessary as the previously mentioned add-ons, but I believe it is also a good idea to have it to be able to keep track of your performance as well as better analyze different aspects of the fight. On a related note, with SCADA you can also track threat, which is important to know when to effectively use your Hand of Salvation. Although while SCADA does the job well, Omen is actually a bit better in terms of tracking threat. The last add-on I want to mention is Pally Power. This is a Paladin specific add-on that lets you really easily buff members of the raid. While there are other ways to buff, I find this add-on to be the easiest since I can instantly see if anyone is missing a buff and to react as fast as possible in order to rebuff it to minimize the effect of that player's death. For macros, not many are actually needed to be competent as a Holy Paladin. The most important one I would highly suggest using is a macro for Divine Sacrifice. As mentioned during our ability review, Divine Sacrifice consists of 2 buffs and for safe usage we need to disable one of them. The macro shown is a simple macro that does exactly that with the added feature to message others that you are using the ability. All of the macros will be added in the description down below for you to copy if you want. The second macro worth using is the Aura Mastery macro, which forces a paladin that is using a specific aura to get off it so you can take it and perform Aura Mastery. The last macro I would review is the macro to cancel Divine Plea. Due to the decreased healing output when Plea is active, you can use this macro to cancel it to continue healing in full. I personally would recommend against using this, as Divine Plea is such an important mana returning ability, and would rather encourage Holy Paladins to just learn the fight so you know when you can safely use it to the full potential. Nonetheless, you can still use this macro if you wish. There are plenty more macros, albeit much less important in my opinion. There are many macros with the mouse over effect for your healing, which depend on your playstyle, but I won't be going over them, so this is where we will end this section. In this last section we will cover general Holy Paladin gameplay as well as some boss specific tips that you can use. In order to maximize your gameplay, certain personal buffs should be applied before each encounter. In general, Holy Paladins benefit the most when eating Fish Fist, as after 10 seconds of eating you gain the Well-Fed buff, increasing stamina and spell power. For flasks, the overall best ones to use are one Guardian Elixir and one Battle Elixir, because you can use two at once as they do not cancel each other out. Use Elixir of Mighty Thoughts to increase your intellect and Elixir of Lightning Speed to boost your haste. Both elixirs last for 1 hour. The only downside to using these two is that their effect does not persist through death. If you die, you will need to reapply them again. The next best elixir is the Flask of Distilled Wisdom, increasing intellect, followed by Flask of the Frostworm, increasing spell power. These flasks count as both Guardian and Battle Elixir, so only one may be used at a time. The flasks also last for 1 hour, but you do not lose debuffs if you die. If you are starting to get low on mana, you can use Runic Mana Potions to restore about 4000 mana, but with the engineering profession you can turn them into Runic Mana Injectors to further increase the amount of mana restored. Most other potions are not really useful for Holy Paladins, except perhaps the Potion of Speed, which increases haste for a short time. This potion can be used during Valithria Dreamwalker to boost healing, but in other encounters I suggest just stick with mana restoration potions for better mana management. One other great potion to keep in mind is the Swiftness potion, which increases running speed by 50% for 15 seconds. If there is an encounter where mana might not be such a big problem, but there is a lot of moving around, this potion can be a nice addition. Keep in mind though that, as for all potions, only one may be used during the whole encounter. As a Holy Paladin, you should always be in the same group with Restoration Shamans and Priests. This is because these two classes have some group specific abilities which we can greatly benefit from. Resto Shamans have access to Mana Tide Totem, which restores mana to group members. Likewise, Priests have access to Hymn of Hope, which in addition to restoring mana also boosts maximum mana by 20%. Since we have so much total mana to begin with, and these spells restore a percentage of mana, they are extremely useful to us. For maximum effect, Resto Shamans and Priests should also use these abilities together. Since Divine Plea mana restoration is also based on a percentage of our total mana, you can use it in conjunction with these two abilities. Generally, as a Holy Paladin, you want to start any encounter by pre-buffing the tanks with Beacon and Sacred Shield. I usually do this about 10 seconds before the pull. This leaves me enough time to also precast one Holy Light to get the initial Light's Grace proc, so my next Holy Light is already shorter. If you have enough time, you can also cast one Flash of Light on the tank with Sacred Shield to proc the heal over time effect, although that usually isn't necessary as the effect is rather insignificant. If there are more Holy Paladins, you should talk with each other to assign who puts beacon on which tank, so healing is more redundant. After the fight starts, try to cast Judgment onto the main target as soon as possible for the haste buff and then position yourself. It depends on the fight where you stand, but usually it's best if you are somewhere near the boss if possible for the Seal of Wisdom mana returns via melee hitting. Make sure to keep track of your Judgment of Light debuff and haste buffs so they are always applied. One ability that we can also mention here that can help with mana return from melee hitting is the Shield of Righteousness. This is a melee ability that has a chance to proc the Seal of Wisdom effect, so you can use it when close to the boss, but you have to move around. Keep in mind though that the proc effect is not 100% and the ability also costs a global cooldown, and there is a small chance to also miss or parry the boss. As mentioned throughout the video, to be an effective Holy Paladin, you need to do two things. First, try to heal as effectively as possible, meaning to time your heals and cooldowns in line with incoming damage. This is why precasting a heal is very important, especially on certain mechanics like Infest at the Lich King. As mentioned during our add-ons review, a boss swing timer also helps here. Secondly, you need to manage your mana well. This mostly comes down to knowing the fight, so you know when to effectively use Divine Plea with or without cooldowns and where to position yourself for Seals of Wisdom procs. As a general rule, try to use Plea as often as possible with either Avenging Wrath or Divine Illumination, meaning as soon as the fight starts, if there is no big damage incoming, just start to use it and rotate it in and out of cooldown. This way you will not have much trouble going out of mana. For the whole duration of the fight you have to keep up 3 buffs, which are Beacon and Sacred Shield on the tanks and Judgment for the haste buff. If you need to apply both Beacon and Sacred Shield, I usually cast Beacon and then a Holy Light followed by Sacred Shield. Try not to cast 2 instant spells at the same time because of the spell queue mechanic, and as well to ensure constant healing on the tanks. It is great to cast your instant spells when you are moving and spam Holy Light when you can stand still. Now let's get into boss specific gameplay tips. Keep in mind that these tips are mostly for 25-man heroic content, but can of course also be applied to other difficulties as well. All of the footage captured was on Warmane's Lordaeron server, which doesn't have the 30% ICC buff and also features increased boss health and shortened enrage timers. As a disclaimer, please keep in mind that this is what I personally do in a fight and what works for me, but I am always up for a discussion and improvement, so if you have any comments, make sure to write them down below. I try to gather footage that best shows good Holy Paladin gameplay in ICC, but it is by no means perfect. At Lord Marrogar, generally both tanks take most of the damage because of his Bone Slice ability, so have a tank beaconed and then keep healing the off tank. When he does Bone Storm, try to use a raid cooldown like Divine Sacrifice and then heal the whole raid. When people get spiked, focus on healing them. At this boss, you can pretty much stay in melee the whole fight, so mana shouldn't be an issue, but watch out for his Cold Flame so you don't take unnecessary damage. Lady Deathwhisper has 2 phases. In the first phase there is not much raid healing needed, but focus healings on the tanks when the adds come. The most important thing to do in phase 1 is to be ready to quickly heal players if they start getting damaged by mind controlled targets. You can also help stun mind controlled people with your Hammer of Justice. Because most of this phase is not as healing intensive, try to conserve your mana so you are full when going into phase 2. Just before you push into phase 2, recast all of the necessary things so you can be ready to heal. Phase 2 of the fight consists of constant raid damage via her Frostbolt volley AoE attacks, which also slow down everyone. To cope with the volley, Frost Resistance Aura Mastery can be used. Heal this damage quickly and use your cooldowns when you see the raid at low health. The most important thing to watch out in phase 2 are the vengeful spirit adds, which follow a player, and if you get to them, they will explode, damaging everyone around it. Always be ready to run from these adds, as they are usually the reason for most wipes. When these adds explode, the type of damage is Shadow Frost, so using Aura Mastery is not worth it, because these combo types of damage always take the lower resistance you have when calculating the damage dealt. If you are slowed by her Frostbolt, you can also cast Hand of Freedom on yourself if you start getting chased by the spirits. Also, be ready to use Hand of Salvation on raid members due to tanks not being able to get aggro due to her Touch of Insignificance ability. The gunship battle is perhaps the easiest fight in the whole ICC. The only thing to consider here is the tank getting damaged when jumping onto the enemy ship, as the boss deals increased damage over time. Use your cooldowns when the raid is jumping onto the enemy ship, and use Divine Plea when everyone is at your ship to manage your mana. You can also hit the adds that spawn on your ship and restore a lot of mana that way. At Deathbringer Sourfang, have a tank beacon and start healing the off tank. Here it depends on your setup, but I usually stay in range. If coordination is good for range DPS on beasts, you can also stand in melee to have an easier time with your mana, so you can proc Seal of Wisdom from time to time. But staying in melee, I suggest avoid using Righteous Fury to not aggro the beast adds by accident. Sourfang gains a lot of his energy when he deals damage via the Boiling Blood debuff, which he casts onto random players. When his energy bar reaches 100%, he casts the Mark of the Fallen Champion onto a random raid member, which deals a ton of damage. The goal of this fight is to prolong his energy gain to get as few marks by the end as possible, because if one mark dies on heroic, the boss heals for 20%, which usually results in a wipe. This is why mitigating his energy gain is very important, and we can help here tremendously by casting Hand of Protection on casters. Avoid using the hand onto melees or hunters though, because they won't be able to attack them, losing valuable DPS. If you are standing in melee, you can also help by stunning the beast with your Hammer of Justice. The boss has a soft enrage at 30%, at which point he increases his attack speed, dealing a lot more damage to tanks and targets debuffed with the mark. Make sure to be good on your mana and set up all your judgments and buffs before this point, as after the frenzy, healing gets much more intense. I usually beacon the first target that gets Mark of the Fallen Champion and just focus healing tanks until the second mark. It depends on the raid DPS how many marks you will have by the end, but you can talk with your fellow healers to plan ahead how you will deal with marks and CDs used. Keep in mind that all damage done to the raid is physical, so cloth and leather DPS classes like mages and priests take a lot more damage and need constant heals to stay alive. At rot phase, one tank takes the boss while another should kite the big ooze. The damage done on the tank kiting the ooze is usually not that big, since he shouldn't get hit at all, so I put beacon on the tank tanking the boss. At this boss you can stay in melee if there are more than 8 ranged players and just focus healing the raid when rot phase does his Slime Spray Cone AoE ability. It can do a lot of damage on ranged DPS, so be ready to top them. At the same time, players can get afflicted by the Vile Gas debuff, also damaging them for a lot, especially if they are also taking damage from his spray at the same time. The other important ability to focus on is the mutated infection debuff, which is casted onto a random player. This debuff ticks for a small amount of damage and reduces healing received by 75%. Once the debuff runs out or is dispelled, a small ooze starts attacking the affected player. Having too many small oozes can spawn many pools of sticky ooze, so the best course of action is to dispel them as soon as they reach the big ooze. Because of the healing reduction, you have to really focus on healing the player. Once the big ooze gets 5 stacks, it explodes and sends projectiles to the spot every player was standing on at the end of its cast. When the explosion happens, you should cast Divine Sacrifice to stabilize the raid. The damage type here is Shadow Nature, so Aura Mastery again doesn't really help unless you do Shadow Resistance and have a Hunter with aspect of the nature active. Only then can you mitigate some of the damage. Faster Gut is mostly a DPS check fight and all raid damage taken is Shadow type. Here the tank takes increasingly more damage due to the gastric bloat debuff, so beacon the main tank and heal the raid. In this fight you can also stand in melee if there are at least 8 ranged DPS players, but watch out for his malleable goose. If you get hit by the goo, your cast times get increased by a lot, but you can remove the effect by using Divine Shield. At the beginning of the fight, a few seconds after the pull, the boss does his Gaseous Blight ability, making the raid take a lot of damage. You can use some minor cooldowns such as GTS to top the raid. The most important thing in this fight is to get all 3 stacks of the inoculated debuff from the gas spores. Similar to Rotface, it's also important to focus on healing the people affected by the vile gas. After 3 rounds of gas spores, Faster Gut does his Pungent Blight ability, dealing severe raid damage, so big raid cooldowns such as Divine Sacrifice and Aura Mastery should be used here in conjunction with Avenging Wrath or Divine Illumination to quickly top raid members off. At the same time, be ready to beacon the other tank that will take the boss. Beacon him and then focus healing the raid. If you want, you can also bubble with your 3 stacks before the Pungent Blight hits, which will make you save the stacks for the next Blight, but at that time the boss should be dead anyway. Professor Putricide consists of 3 phases. Usually one tank is tanking the boss for the whole fight, while the other turns himself into the mutated abomination. The tank on the boss doesn't really take that much damage, so the priority here is healing the big spikes of damage because of his other mechanics. In the beginning of the fight, a few seconds after the pull, the boss spawns slime puddles which appear on the location where a green vial hits the ground. This vial has a travel animation and usually ranged DPS has more time to move away from it than melees. That's why in the beginning you should focus your healing on melees. Since healing is not that intense, you can also use Divine Plea early in the fight. To deal with the green volatile ooze stay in range and focus healing melees. Try to precast your heal so it lands just after the ooze finishes casting his volatile ooze adhesive. After the cast is finished, the ooze starts moving towards the affected player, and since usually the tactic is that all melees stay close to the ooze to soak the initial damage, focus on healing them first. For the first soak you can use your GTS or another small cooldown, since most of the time there are enough soakers, but for the second soak use a bigger rate cooldown like Divine Sacrifice. If you get targeted by the gas cloud focus on mostly healing yourself with your instant spells and just run away from it. You can let others know you need to run, so they will take over the healing. If the gas cloud comes too close to you and the raid risks getting wiped, casting Hand of Protection on the targeted player will cause the ad to retarget another player, so you can gain valuable time and potentially save the raid. Both the green and orange ads have in common that when they target a random player, they put a damaging debuff on him, so focus healing that member. The most critical moments regarding healing are in the transition phases where both adds are present. In the second phase though, healing is less intense since they just rotate between themselves. If there are no adds, you can cast Divine Plea and even go hit the boss for mana. You can also try hitting the boss a bit just at the beginning of the transition phase when he is running to the table, since there is nothing to heal then. The other mechanic in this fight is the Unbound Plague debuff, which deals more and more damage each tick. Generally, you should have this debuff for around 10 seconds before passing it to the next player. Also, watch out for the random malleable goose flying towards the ranged players. Avoid them to not get a debuff that makes your cast times longer. After the second transition phase, the last phase begins, where the most important thing is to keep the tanks and selected raid members alive that have the mutated plague on them. If any of the debuffed players die, the boss heals for a lot, which usually leads to a wipe, so this is an absolute priority. Blood Prince Council has 3 bosses and 2 tanks. One tank usually takes Khaleset, while the other tank takes the 2 bosses at once, Velanar and Taldaram. I put Beacon on the Khaleset tank and just keep healing the tank with the other 2 bosses, as he is taking the most damage for the whole fight. If everything goes according to plan, there really isn't a lot of raid damage, so as a Holy Paladin you should strictly heal tanks all of the time. In the beginning you should position yourself on a pre-assigned spot and ideally never move from there unless a shock vortex spawns near you. The spot is usually somewhere in the middle to be able to reach all tanks, but this means you won't be near the bosses for melee attacking. Then just keep spamming Holy Light and start your Divine Plea rotation as soon as possible. Try to always be more than 12 yards from other players when Velanar is empowered to avoid getting knocked back on his empowered Shock Vortex cast. On this Vortex cast you can also do a Divine Sacrifice to mitigate possible damage if raid members aren't spread enough. If you somehow find yourself in range of someone, you can also bubble to avoid being knocked. Since there isn't much raid damage here, I like to use Solace and Meteorite Crystal together to not run out of mana, since I'm in a ranged position. Because I'm focusing on healing the tanks, my priority is never to heal the raid, as other healers can manage that. Other than that, there really isn't much more to this fight as a Holy Paladin. Blood Queen Lanathel, like Festergut, is a DPS race with a lot of raid damage due to her Shroud of Sorrow ability. Most of the damage here is Shadow type. Because of her other ability, Blood Bolt Splash, ranged members need to be spread from each other by at least 8 yards, otherwise they take increased damage. For that reason, healers are usually assigned in the middle to reach everyone and be spread from everyone by that distance. As a Holy Paladin, ideally you should be located forward in that circle, because if you get swarming shadows on yourself, you can just bubble to cancel the debuff, so there is no need to run to the wall. The tanks here share a link between them, so the main tank receives melee damage from the boss, while the other tank receives 100% of the damage in form of shadow damage. Beacon the main tank and then focus healing the other tank and the raid. Her Shroud of Sorrow AoE damage gets increased by 5% every time another bite is performed, which means damage dealt to the raid gets increased throughout the fight. In this fight, focus healing the tanks except when Lanathel does her Pact of the Dark Fallen, which links 3 random members that need to run to each other. While the link is active, lots of damage is happening to those targets and players close to them, so focus healing them for the duration. Before the link, it is also a good idea to do Shadow Aura Masteries to mitigate some of the damage. Her other mechanic called Swarming Shadows shouldn't really damage the debuffed players, since ideally the flames are spawning behind the affected player, which needs to kite them, so perhaps cast a heal on them, but it shouldn't really be a priority for you. When she gets to her air phase, you can try to get a few melee hits in for mana and then go back to your spot and do some raid cooldowns like Divine Sacrifice. During her air phase, the raid takes a lot of damage, so your healing output is important. After her air phase is done, in a few seconds there is always another link, so you should be ready to react accordingly. Just like at Blood Prince Council, try to start your Divine Plea rotation soon, but watch out so it doesn't coincide with the links or air phase to get the most out of your healing in those critical moments. At Valeria Dreamwalker, Holy Paladins are usually assigned to enter portals due to our strong single target heals. In this fight, healing output is most important, so you can switch some of your gear to gain more spell power. I usually equip my Lich King weapon as well as the Librum of Veracity and the Pandora Split Trinket. If you lack healing, you can also use the Glyph of Seal of Light and Potions of Speed for additional output. At the start, I usually free them myself and cast a Holy Light before the pull to avoid the potential slow from the mage's Frostbolt AoE and to get the initial Light's Grace proc. When you start running to Valeria, also cast a Judgment for the haste proc and then beacon her. The way Holy Paladins heal this boss is to put beacon on her, stand close to her and heal yourself. This way you indirectly heal her via beacon and also heal her by splashing your Glyph of Holy Light heals. If there is a Warlock or Hunter pet with the increased 40% healing received buffs, you can heal the pet. For effective cooldown usage, it really depends how many portals you need to enter. If the healing group is strong enough, 2 portals are enough to heal Valeria to full. This means we save our Avenging Wrath and Divine Illumination cooldowns for the end. If we enter 3 or more portals though, using these 2 abilities at the beginning is better, since they will come off cooldown for the final push. In the video I'm showing you, I'm actually not doing the most efficient way. What you ideally want to be doing is before you enter each portal, refresh beacon on Valeria and cast Judgment onto a random ad, so you keep all of your buffs for the next cycle of healing, because the more stacks you have active, the more important each Holy Light is. Inside portals, have Crusader Aura active to boost your flying speed and even use Aura Mastery for an additional boost. The more debuff stacks you have, the more damage you take, but you can use Sacred Shield on yourself and use Holy Shock and Flash of Light to proc the heal over time effect, which is enough to cover this damage. After the final portal, you should Bloodlust and use all of your cooldowns. As mentioned before, also use Lay on Hands on the boss, since the spell benefits from all of those healing boosts as well as your debuff stacks. If a priest is present in the raid, he should also cast the Guardian Spirit ability onto the boss for an additional boost in healing, and that should be the end of the fight. Sindragosa does constant raid damage via her Frost Aura ability and has 2 phases. As a Holy Paladin, you can contribute a lot with all of your cooldowns here, making the whole encounter much easier. In the first phase, one tank should be tanking the boss, so beacon him and heal the raid. This fight really depends on how often you get the Unchained Magic debuff. This debuff stacks the more you use your abilities and explodes for the amount of stacks when the timer runs out. The damage is dealt to you and everyone 20 yards around you, so you need to track that range to know when you're far enough from others. Casting Judgment doesn't add a stack. If you get Unchained Magic, ideally you shouldn't do anything, but if you do heal, try not to get more than 6 stacks. When you want to explode, go to the edge of the balcony to move from others, but don't go past that big spike, since Sindragosa's Frost Breath can kill you beyond it. If you don't get the debuff, focus healing melees that are getting high stacks of Chilled to the Bone debuff, which are usually rogues and warriors due to their fast attack speed. Then watch for casters that have high stacks of instability and try to precast your heal so it lands as soon as their debuff runs out. When Sindragosa does her Blistering Cold ability, you should use your raid cooldowns. It's best if you talk before the pull which healer does which cooldowns and when. Be aware that the farther away from her you are, the longer the pull time, which means less time to run out of her range. At the beginning of the transition air phase, random people get selected for tombs. Prioritize stopping them before they freeze. Be aware that even when they freeze, there is a small window where you can still heal them before the tombs actually spawn. What I usually do is precast a Holy Light on one player, and when I see they get frozen in place, immediately cast a Holy Shock on another one. If there is still time and the shock crits, I also try to cast an instant Flash of Light on a third member. During transition is the time to regain your mana. You can hit tombs and use Divine Plea without any cooldowns. Before this phase ends, rebuff the tanks with Beacon and Sacred Shield and start to heal them again. When the boss reaches 35%, the second phase begins. You should be full on your mana, so you are fully ready to start healing the raid hard. In this phase you get a new debuff called Mystic Buffet, which continuously stacks and each stack increases your damage taken. To clear the stacks, you have to hide behind the tombs that are spawning. As a general rule, try not to go above 4 stacks of the buffet, as then you are really taking a lot of damage and can die very quickly. If you get Unchained Magic in this phase, use your Divine Shield quickly to clear the debuff. This will make the healing much easier. Be aware that using your bubble won't clear Mystic Buffet stacks, so hiding behind the tombs is still important. But if you are about to get tombed, you can still use the shield, making you immune to the damage to ensure your survival. An advanced Holy Paladin tip is to continuously casting and getting high stacks of instability, and then just before the timer runs out, use bubble when far away from the raid to clear the stacks. But make sure to time it correctly, because otherwise you can kill yourself and others around you, which can lead to a wipe. For the last 10% of Sindragosa's health, usually raids just ignore everything and damage her as much as possible. If you are affected by Unchained Magic, you can just spam heals until the timer runs out and then die, but make sure you are far enough from the raid anyway. And now for the last and arguably the hardest fight in ICC, the Lich King. This fight consists of 3 phases, the first two being the hardest, while the last phase is a bit easier. The whole encounter basically consists of how well you can manage constant damage combined with big damage spikes on tanks and the raid, all the while managing your mana as effectively as possible due to the long duration of the encounter. To heal this fight effectively, it is extremely important to precast your heals when dealing with infests and soul reapers. Normally the fight requires 2 tanks, where in the first phase the main tank takes Lich King, while the off tank is on Shambling Horrors. Lich King does a lot of damage on tanks with his normal melee attacks and requires constant healing, so the tanks need to be topped off pretty much the whole fight. If you miss some of your cooldowns and healing, and combined with a bit of bad luck, the main tank can basically die in 2 or 3 hits. This is a fight where Holy Paladins are extremely important and our whole focus is on healing the tanks. If there are 2 Holy Paladins, one should beacon the main tank in phase 1 and the other beacons the off tank, so both tanks are getting healed. Running 2 Holy Paladins, I suggest one be in melee range and the other with the range group. This way there is always at least one Paladin standing still and healing the tanks if the other needs to move because of shadow traps. In other phases, both Holy Paladins then beacon the tank taking the boss. In the footage shown, I'm the only Holy Paladin though, and healing tanks is my utmost priority while other healers take care of the raid group. I usually stand in melee group to get a bit of melee hits in, and I beacon the off tank and spam heal the main tank. This way my Holy Light splash from the glyph also heals melees a bit. Before the fight starts, cast your beacon and sacred shield and precast Holy Light when you see Tyrion run over the symbol on the ground. With this timing, your heal will land exactly when tanks get the first hit. When Lich King starts casting Infest, usually start precasting your Holy Light when the boss's cast is at half bar. This way your heals will land exactly just after Infest hits. Every Infest should be done like this. In phase 1, I usually use my Divine Plea together with Avenging Wrath first, just a couple of seconds after the pull. This way I can again use Divine Plea with Divine Illumination towards the end of the phase. Lich King does increasingly more damage towards the end of the phase due to his stacking Plague Siphon buff, which increases his damage output when Necrotic Plague gains stacks. This is the reason why you should use Avenging Wrath first, since it gives only 20% increased healing when Divine Illumination provides 35% more output. When you enter transition phase, focus on healing the mages first, since they usually stay on the Lich King, but if they position themselves poorly, can take damage from Remorseless Winter. You can also use small cooldowns like GTS in transition phase. I usually stay in range to try and avoid getting pain and suffering stacks. Rebuff Beacon on the main tank and focus mostly healing melee, and try to dispel the Soul Shriek debuff from tanks since it silences them. If the raid group is stabilized enough, you can use Divine Plea without any cooldowns, since healing shouldn't be super intense here. If mages are on the boss, be ready to use Hand of Salvation on a mage just before the phase ends. When going into phase 2, I usually stand and heal the tanks while other healers run into position before moving myself. Ideally, you should have at least around 70% mana when going into phase 2. The whole phase 2 basically consists of constant infest casts and the new Soul Reaper mechanic, which deals massive damage to the tanks. The tanks should have their own cooldowns to deal with the Reaper, but we should always try to precast our heal so it lands just after the Reaper hits the tanks, and just spam Holy Light for the second portion of the Reaper effect. For managing your mana, try not to use Divine Plea on its own, but rather use Avenging Wrath or Divine Illumination. In this phase, tanks again take increasingly more damage towards the end due to the Valkyries damaging them. If you get low on mana, you should be standing in melee most of the time and try to get a few melee hits in. But be aware when Defile is coming and try to mentally prepare yourself if you get selected. For this reason, I always have Lich King on focus, because when he selects a target for Defile, he targets them while casting it and you have much more time to react this way. The second transition phase is basically the same as the first one. Just at the beginning you can avoid the initial tick of Remorseless Winter by jumping onto the platform. Raging Spirits spawn much faster this time around, and there is a bit more dispelling to be done on the tanks. Once the transition phase ends, run onto the platform and spam your Holy Light on the tank taking Lich King, while have the off tank beaconed, since both will be taking quite a bit of damage. When you get inside Frostmourne, generally this is considered a down phase with not much healing. Initially though, the whole raid is low on health due to Lich King's Harvest Soul ability. As soon as I get into the room, I stand still a bit and get a few Holy Lights out to top the raid. After the raid is stabilized, start moving with the group to avoid the spirit bombs. The group should move slowly, so you can stop and cast a Holy Light or two and then move again. You can also use Divine Plea here without any cooldowns when in the room. Just before the room ends, rebuff the tank with Beacon and Sacred Shield. Then, as soon as the raid gets out of the room, Lich King casts Defile. Be ready to move from the raid group, but if you are not targeted, focus your healing on the tanks. Due to the Vile Spirits, everybody needs to move to the other side of the platform. When you are moving, try to cast a heal, then move a bit and then cast a heal again. When moving, you can also use Holy Shock and recast Judgment. As soon as you reach the other side, Lich King always casts another Defile. After the Defile, the whole raid should move behind the Lich King to have an easier soaking of the spirits. At this point, the Lich King starts to spawn a new set of the spirits, and while he is channeling his cast, there is no damage done by him, so feel free to stop healing and just do some melee attacks to regenerate tons of mana. The whole last phase is basically just running from one side of the platform to the other and chilling inside the rooms. The most important thing here is to learn how to effectively move while still throwing out heals. Generally, after 4 rooms, the Lich King enrages, but if you have done everything successfully until this point, congratulations, the Lich King will die and you will have conquered ICC as a Holy Paladin. So, we finally come to the end of this extremely long video. I think I have pretty much exhausted all of my knowledge about the PvE Holy Paladin in patch 3.3.5, although I'm sure there are still things that I might not have covered or not went as in-depth as I could. For that reason, I'd very much appreciate it if you leave a comment with your questions or other tips for myself and others down in the comments. Even after playing this pack for years, I still find new things to learn, and I encourage everyone else to also keep this in mind. To become good, knowledge and experience both play a part, but even after conquering this pack, always be open to new things that can help you improve even more. If you have any recommendations or tips for me, I'd be happy to learn something new, and I hope this video becomes sort of a platform for all Holy Paladins to share their knowledge and help improve each other. Special thanks also to EQE, another Master Holy Paladin, for many insights about this pack and for peer reviewing this video. You can find his channel down in the description. In the end, if you found this video helpful, I'd be very happy if you shared it with others you think might find it interesting. It took me a lot of time and effort to make it, and I really appreciate you all for watching. Thanks so much and happy healing!